Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for their attendance and their increased attention at the end of a very long but very interesting day. So thank you very much for staying on for this last presentation today. I'm also talking on behalf of a colleague of mine as well, in Dr. Saalem Sadeque, who's based at our Perth campus. One of the real pivotal things that's been coming up within the higher education sector, and certainly something that CQUniversity has also highlighted as an area of key importance, is very much looking at student retention rates. It's almost like the elephant in the room, and it's not just us at CQUniversity. When you start to look at some of the broader statistics and broader issues, it's something that's systemic to the higher education sector. How do we engage students? How do we continue to engage them, to retain them, and to maintain their engagement to complete successfully? As educators, as academics, we don't want to see students fail. We want to, through co-creation of knowledge, assist them to be able to develop the important skill sets that they require to enter the workplace with those important skills. So my role at CQUniversity, yes, I'm a senior lecturer in marketing, but I'm also the discipline leader for the marketing and tourism discipline within the College of Business that comes into play. So of course, this was something at the forefront of many discussions that we had at discipline level. And Saalem and I then started to explore this a little more and saying, okay, we know the importance of student retention, we know the importance of completion rates, and how do we see what impacts those key elements? And from what Saalem and I have identified to this point in time, there are a series of academic as well as non-academic factors that do directly impact on student retention and completion rates. Oh, my screen's just frozen. Oh, there we go. So just as a brief overview with regards to the presentation today, I'll spend a little bit of time just giving some further background to the particular topic, leading into some of those key questions, as well as the proposed study that Saalem and I are currently working on. And I think this particular graphic just really highlights that, you know, we don't want to be losing anyone through the education process that comes into play. So if we look right at the beginning, when we start to look at those student attrition rates, as I said, it's systemic within the higher education sector. It's not related to a specific university. The latest statistics that I could get my hands on were back in 2017, but we were looking at 17.8% attrition rate in the higher education sector. So, I mean, that's quite large when we start to think about this. We also are very well aware that the relationship between students and academic members of staff is a two-way communication system in order to try and get those desired learning outcomes for our students through co-creation of knowledge. And of course, as we've seen now with the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, technological innovation has become more and more prevalent and more important in maintaining that student engagement. But of course, underlying all of these, or underpinning all of these key elements, is interaction and engagement. We know that these are the critical components when we are talking about assisting students, retaining students, and helping them succeed with their actual programs that come into play. And it becomes even more critical, as has been highlighted with the pandemic, in an online environment that comes into play. How do we maintain that engagement, that interaction with students? And how do we also ensure that they are still succeeding in difficult circumstances with the pandemic in particular? Now, when you start to explore the literature in a bit more detail, you will find that there are three different types of interaction that have been widely described for effective learning. The very first one of those is with regards to learner-content interaction. So the interaction between the student and the materials that are available to that student and the time that they actually spend with that course materials. So here at CQU, our system is Moodle. So the actual content and context that we have on Moodle, how often do they actually access that content? You know, what are the hot spots? If we start to think about it in the sense of a heat map, where do they spend their most time? Is it the most proactive or productive areas that they're focusing that energy on? You know, is it looking at readings or textbook materials? Is it about lecture slides and videos? Is it about interactive texts or any other type of learning materials that come into play. So that's the first point of interaction that's described. The second one is between the learner or the student and the instructor, and the interaction between those two individuals. So again, here we are talking about a two-way communication process between the learner and the facilitator of that knowledge. And ideally here, we're talking about facilitating that continuous collaboration and hoping to stimulate further interactions with study materials for those students. So in other words, they're not just engaging with the material in isolation from the actual facilitator, and that facilitator empowering the student to explore beyond just say a classroom context. So whether that's a virtual classroom or a face-to-face bricks and mortar classroom. And the third type of interaction is very much between peers, learner to learner interaction. So in other words, a learning community of peers within that process. So encouraging students to engage with their peers within a virtual situation as well as external to that. So it's not just during scheduled classes or scheduled interactions that comes into play, and to encourage them to explore and apply concepts. So they're the three kind of academic factors that's been identified in the literature to assist students with regards to effective learning and engaging them. And there's also literature out there that does suggest the high levels of engagement and interaction can also negate the negativeness with regards to student attrition rates that comes in. And we know that the flow-on effect to that, if we have low student attrition rates, the completion rates also improve through that process. But there are also some non-academic or other factors that do affect that interaction and engagement for students. And three of them that are quite interesting that Saalem and I have been exploring are the very first one, student-university identification. So here it's about how students perceive themselves and whether or not they feel like they belong to the university that they are actually enrolled with. So it results in direct interactions between the university and the students, and that's also come up as quite an important factor in many aspects when we start to think about belongingness and feeling a part of that broader university community. The second one is with regards to students' online readiness. So it's one thing to have computer literacy skills. It's another to have the level of skill required to actively engage and interact for a learning knowledge acquisition process. So things like computer internet self-efficacy, self-directed learning, learner control, all come into that, as well as motivation for learning and online communication self-efficacy. And the third component that we've been exploring is with regards to students' personal innovativeness. So in other words here, students' willingness to try new technologies for learning purposes. And we say here specifically for learning purposes, not just say a social media general type of account that they might be socializing on. So what we actually have been able to identify is that, you know, from the literature, students today are considered digital natives with highly developed technological skills. But when you start to delve a little bit deeper, what is less clear is whether students have developed technological skills that are adaptable to the online education context, and if this improves student retention and completion rates. And this is where our interest really lies that's come through. I'm very happy to share with you here our proposed study. And you'll notice that I've said here proposed. We haven't collected data yet on this, but it is something that we are working towards. But as I've mentioned earlier, we've identified some key academic factors in the sense of learner-content interaction, learner-instructor interaction, and learner-learner interaction, as well as three key non-academic factors, that's student-university identification, students' online readiness, and students' personal innovativeness. And the key here is to see how these variables or these factors actually impact upon student retention rates as well as student completion rates. What we're hoping to actually achieve is to sample 600 students using CQUniversity's Qualtrics team. Now, certainly at CQUniversity, even prior to the pandemic, where everything had to move into an online form of delivery. We already did have an online delivery method. We did have a whole series of students who self-selected to learn through an online mode. So that makes it very, very interesting for us with regards to our data capture. We are hoping to be able to capture students that already pre-selected that online study mode as a form of study with us, as well as students who haven't pre-selected that study option. Now, in many cases, international students, for one, they are restricted as to how many units they can actually take in an online mode. So we do have some differences there. So we're wanting to capture both cohorts. We are also wanting to capture students within this 600 student capture at different levels within their degrees at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels, so that we can actually assess if there are any differences across the learning journey. So we are thinking of a cross-sectional study initially as part of this, stage one of this type of research that comes into play. All of the factors that you see here on the screen have actually been developed from the literature, and they do have some pre-existing scales that have been pre-tested and have been identified as valid and reliable. So I'd like to just sort of share a couple of these types of items with you so that you're aware of what each of these factors or variables are actually identifying. So for example, with the learner content interaction scale, and this was developed by Quo et al. In 2014. So some of the items in this include online course materials helped me to better understand the class content. Online course materials stimulated my interest in the course, and online course materials helped me relate my personal experience to new concepts or new knowledge. So just a sample there, just to give you an idea as to the type of items that are being captured within that learner content interaction scale. Similarly, in the learner-instructor scale that comes into play, again developed by Quo and his colleagues in 2014. Some of the sample items there are: I had numerous interactions with the instructor during the class. I asked the instructor my questions through different electronic means, such as email, discussion forum, instant messaging tools, etc. I replied to messages from the instructor. Again, just a sample of the scale items for the learner-instructor interaction scale. Or the learner-to-learner interaction scale, again looking at that student learning community situation, include things like: overall, I had numerous interactions related to the course content with fellow students. I got lots of feedback from my classmates. I communicated with my classmates about the course content through different electronic means, such as email, discussion forums, instant messaging tools, etc. So again, sort of giving you a bit of a broader feel for the types of academic factors that we'll be exploring or asking students to respond to. From a non-academic factor perspective, if we start to look at things like student university identification, this particular scale was developed by Mail and Ashforth in 1992, so it's been around for quite some time. Includes items like: when someone criticises my university, it feels like a personal insult. Or I'm very interested in what others think about my university. When I talk about my university, I usually say we rather than they. So again, just giving you some idea about, you know, that belongingness and connectedness to that university identification. Another one that we found really interesting is this student online readiness. Despite the fact that students do have digital literacy, whether or not they are ready to be able to learn through an online means could be quite different. There are 5 dimensions that have been identified by Hung et al. In 2010 around this. And that included the computer internet self-efficacy, which could, I'll give you a sample question here, is: I feel confident in performing the basic functions of Microsoft Office programs, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. They've also identified self-directed learning. So a question there within that particular scale is: I seek assistance when facing learning problems. A third scale that they identified within this is learner control in an online context. And a sample question is, I can direct my own learning progress. Motivation for learning in an online context was another one that they identified, and a sample item is, I have motivation to learn. And online communication self-efficacy was the last set of scale items that they identified, and that was an example here is, I feel confident in posting questions in online discussions. So again, we can see that it sort of ranges across a number of sub-dimensions when we start to look at online readiness and being able to gauge students' confidence within those elements. And the final one there about students' personal innovativeness. And this was work done by Van Raj and Sheepers back in 2008. So some of the example items there are, if I hear about new information technology, I would look for ways to experiment with it, as well as I like to experiment with new information technologies. So just sort of gives you a bit of a taste for the type of scale items that we've identified with regards to these key elements. So of course, once we've collected the data, we're going to analyse this data both using descriptive statistics as well as multivariate analysis in the form of structural equation modelling. Of course, we'll only be using aggregated data, and that's what we're going to be reporting when we are getting some findings on that. So the key here is we've identified that this project would be of value and that it would identify the key academic and non-academic factors that actually influence student retention rates and completion rates. This information would be pivotal in allowing universities to provide targeted interventions to maximise student retention and completion rates. Thank you for your time, and I welcome any thoughts, questions, or any ideas that people are willing to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for a very exciting presentation on your exciting project. So we do look forward to your findings in future. Meanwhile, anybody has any comments or questions, please feel free to ask.
Just one question, Anne. I think there seems to be the puzzle that we're all kind of working on. There doesn't seem to be very much scope for catching up with the people who have fallen through the cracks. Have you given any thought to that or much thought to that?
Oh, look, Garrick, it's a very valid question. It is quite a complex situation that many of us are grappling with in that sense. We haven't actually started to look at, what are the avenues. I know that our university has quite a series of policies as well as procedures where they're trying to capture students at that back end. We haven't explored that as part of the scope of this project, but certainly potentially as stage 2 or stage 3 component down the track, that would certainly be something that we'd be exploring further and trying to use that information to help triangulate what we might be finding as well.
Thanks, that sounds great.
And I was going to ask you, thank you for your presentation. How many students are you intending to survey, and how are you going to survey them?
Yeah, no, thank you, Edward. That's a very good question that you're raising.
Just out of curiosity, really.
For sure. Look, what we'd be hoping for would be a sample size of around 600 students. The way that we'd be looking at trying to sample those, given that we're academic members of staff, we don't want to be seen to be in a power situation with the students. So we'd be looking at using the Qualtrics team at CQUniversity to actually collect that data. So it is removed from us as academic members of staff, so students feel comfortable to share that information. That's the plan. Thank you.